Well, Mike, thanks for joining us once again. You were the very first guest that we had back on September 23rd, 2021. We're going strong here, but it all started with you. So I appreciate you joining us once again and catching up a little bit with you once again.
It's great to see you, Mike. I mean, it's people always laugh when I tell them who you're talking to. Today. I said Mike Vaccaro, and they say, "Oh, you're talking to yourself again. Time to go to the home." I say, "No. It's a different Mike Vaccaro. So it's the real Mike Vaccaro."
Well, I don't know. The other, as you put it last time
We
when
can be,
you and I were together here.
that's right. We can be
But
co-Mike Vaccaros. Oh, I think that's probably the fair way to put it.
there we go. There we go. To refresh people, you're New York Post sports writer. You've been there since 2002 now, right? I mean, that was kind of your dream job,
Yeah,
and you've been doing
yeah.
it that long. What's it been like for you?
Oh, it's been terrific. I mean, look, I wanted to be a sports columnist my whole life. I was specifically wanted to be a columnist in the New York Post my whole life because that was the sports section I grew up reading. And, maybe my ambition should have been a little higher than that. Maybe I should have asked to be a senator or a governor or a president, but I'll settle for this. This is a pretty good way to make a living. And, you have more friends that way, I think.
Over 50 writing awards for you as well. When you look back at that, is there an award that really sticks out in your mind, something that you've won during your time?
I won I think it was a smaller one, but it was a New Jersey State Award I won, God, almost 25 years ago, which was based on stuff I wrote right after the, tragic events of 9/11. And so I, tried to do some sports, but overall theme stuff. And that actually won a couple of citations. So I probably would say that's the one that I cherish most of all. I do like the ones I won in Arkansas though, because the plaques are pretty cool. They're shaped like Arkansas. So people walk into my office and they see a couple of Arkansas plaques, like what in the world is that? And so it gives me a story to tell.
Yeah, that was a long, long time ago for you. But
Yes,
you
it
mentioned 9/11. That to be able to step out of maybe the realm of sports at times is that something that's a little exciting, or is it a little nerve wracking when it's different than what you typically maybe cover and write about?
Well, it's definitely different, but I like it. I like people are people, right? My mentor in this business was the great Dave Anderson of the New York Times, and he told me, when I told him one time I was nervous about covering a hockey playoff run, he said, "But they're just people. They're just people who play hockey. In the same way that if, there were people who play baseball, and if you were writing news, there were, mayors and controllers who were just people, and you write about the people, and that's what other people are going to want to read about." So I've tried to kind of use that as my mantra throughout, and it's kind of served me well.
You've written books. You've got one coming out now, and all there have been baseball books. Why baseball? What is it with baseball that maybe means a little bit more to you than the other sports?
Baseball is just a great writing sport. It's every day. It's the everydayness of it. There's a whole set of characters, new set of characters every day, a whole new set of themes and storylines, and it's just an endless procession of potential stories and potential ideas and controversies and so forth. Yeah, I do. I do like writing baseball a lot. I mean, basketball is probably my other sport because I played it, but I mean, not very long and not very well, but I did play it, so I understand the game a little better than other sports maybe. So when people tell me you never played the game, I can correct them and say that's not true. I played varsity basketball for Chaminade High School. How dare you? But but baseball, is really a great rider sport. Boxing was a great rider sport too back in the day, but that's become so marginalized. You hardly ever get a fight in your area that's worth trekking out to. So it's baseball is a great writing sport. I love writing basketball and football too, and the occasional golf and tennis. But baseball is probably the bread and butter, certainly for 6 months of the year.
Well, let's get into your new book that's coming out here, "The Bosses of the Bronx." It's been a while since you wrote a book, so why now?
Yeah, I wrote 3 books in about 5 years, which is probably too severe a pace. I kind of got a little burned out on it. Took some time off. I just never found a subject I was really interested in as much to, you really got to commit to a book if you're going to write 350 pages about something or more. But it's the Steinbrenner thing. I remember talking to the editor I worked with at Harper Books, and Sean Desmond, and it was really kind of his idea to think about maybe doing something on Steinbrenner, and it just kind of evolved from there, and it was a very consuming project, but it was also a very rewarding one because, look, I mean, there are a lot of stories that you and I might know, but there's entire generations of Yankee fans who weren't alive when George was being George, which was, the most famous sports writer of all time. And also, one of the most polarizing figures in New York sports history. And all of that is kind of part of the whole story from 1973 on. And now, of course, his son Hal, who couldn't be far more different than George. You talk about God having a blueprint and making people laugh. I mean, they could, show me the DNA, I guess people want to say, because they're nothing alike. But he is his father's son in terms of the fact that, while people wonder if he cares as much as his old man did, he really does, and he burns to win. He just shows it in different ways.
How much of the research kind of did you already have because you were covering maybe the tail end of George Steinbrenner when he was the boss at the time there?
Yeah, I did it. I kind of did it in three ways. One, I mean, I did a lot of research. And look, all my books are historical, so I've tended to spend a lot of time in the archive section at the New York Public Library. Thankfully, there's been an advent of newspaper archives the last couple of years. So it used to take, hours at a time, including a long commute to the city to do that. Now you can just do on your iPad, which is amazing. And so there was that. There was a lot of archival work, a lot of research, a lot of just kind of going through it day by day from January 3rd, 1973 on. I really did that. And then, look, I mean, yes, a lot of it I lived myself. I've reported myself. I'm very meticulous about keeping notes, keeping old columns and old stories. So everything I've ever written about the man was somewhere within my reach to be able to find. And even stuff I didn't write, just stuff I'd written into a notebook was there, or into a tape recorder was there. So a lot of that, and I started really covering George in earnest around 1998 or so, although I'd been around him going back to 1995 a little bit. And then, then there was a lot of primary reporting and research. Although, I approached that and I told everyone I talked to that, in the interest of being able to tell stories completely and fairly without, like a lot of people years after the fact, like to sanitize stories. And I said, look, I'm not going to attach the story to you. Just tell me what happened. And, I'll make a point of mentioning after the fact that, a lot of people talked to me here and confirmed all the stories in this book. I mean, look, the problem you have with that is that, like, there was one guy who really tried to kind of talk me off a story that I know happened the way it happened, because three or four of his teammates told me exactly what was said, and he wanted to make it a little bit less impactful. And, respectfully, I had to say, look, I just know how this went down, and so I'm going to have to write it that way. Um, look, I mean, there were a lot of people who, after they were done playing ball, wound up, George was very good to a lot of his old players. I mean, he wound up reconciling with everybody, Dave Winfield, Yogi Berra, all these people he had feuds with. I mean, he basically tried to ruin Dave Winfield, and in the process almost ruined himself. And yet the two of them reconciled late in Steinbrenner's life. Winfield threw out the first pitch at a playoff game, late in Steinbrenner's life. So that tells you, and, a lot of ex-Yankees went to work for the Yankees. George took care of these guys. And so they weren't about to, tell me fresh stories, certainly, but they, I think if they had the opportunity, they would have tried to sanitize some of the old stories, even though in the moment, in the day, these things happen exactly as they know it happened. But, that's just kind of the way that's a little bit how the sausage is made, but that's really how I came about, using all three of those tools to put together, the book that I came up with.
So almost maybe what, 20 years from when he took over to when you started covering him. So when you're doing the research and you learn about him before you started covering him, was it a different type of person that you found that from one point to another?
Well, it was definitely, he's definitely a different guy than the guy that I knew. But I grew up in New York. I wasn't necessarily a Yankees fan, but I certainly knew all about the Yankees, about all their history, about all their lore. So I knew everything about the Yankees, knew everything about Steinbrenner. The stories that I wanted rereading, I know that I also read in the minute, at least from like 1975 on. I might have been too young to really understand what was going on in 1973 and 74, but certainly thereafter, all those stories were familiar to me as somebody who grew up around here. So, that part of it was all familiar. But, the interesting thing, Mike, is that, for a lot of, really a lot of people under the age of 40 almost, the George they remember is a lot different than the one that's presented in this book, at least for the first, couple of chapters, because the one in the book was young, he was active, he was overactive, he was over involved, he was hyper involved. He changed managers every year. He changed general managers every year. I mean, the one that came back and that people remember from the later championship seasons, believed a lot more instability because he saw what the results of stability brought him, which was three more championships, or five more championships in his lifetime, seven overall. And, he was willing to let bygones be bygones, although in one last final stroke, he was probably most responsible for Joe Torre losing his job in 2007 because he wasn't happy with how that playoff series went in Cleveland. But even then, I mean, his voice was heard. He wasn't the one who necessarily swung the axe, but that was the last transaction in his lifetime.
Where does his drive and his passion for this franchise come from in you doing your research?
Well, look, I mean, he was his father's son. His father was a demanding dad, a taskmaster, very exacting, very sparse in his outpourings of affection. And later on in life, they became much closer. But George was always trying to prove something to his father. His father always thought he was foolish to want to dabble in sports. He figured his time could be spent better with the family shipbuilding business. When George bought the ABL franchise in Cleveland, his father threw up his hands and said, "When's this kid going to learn?" And that franchise failed, and the league failed. But he never lost his desire. He tried to buy the Cleveland Indians around 1970, 71 or so, and failed in that pursuit. That was a dream. That was a dream for him because he grew up an Indians fan as a Clevelander. But he met Gabe Paul, who was the general manager of the then Indians at the time, and said, "Look, if you hear anything, put your ear to the grindstone. You hear about any other sport, any other teams that are available, please let me know, and I want to get involved." Sure enough, 2 years later, Paul told him about the Yankees, introduced him to Michael Burke, who was instrumental in bringing George and his group on board, and was partners with George for about 15 minutes until George phased him out. And that was, but Gabe Paul also was the guy who wound up basically building that first great championship team in the mid '70s, while George was serving the first of his two suspensions. And of course, ironically, the second great dynasty also happened in absentia when Stick Michael took over the show, another guy from Cleveland. So he always kept his friends close, and knew who he could rely on. And in moments of crises, that's the guys he turned to.
Talking about the bosses of the Bronx, your new book coming out of here about George Steinbrenner, the family owning the franchise since 1973. So again, it's not just a franchise; it's the Yankees. How much does that play into the story and everything else that it's this elevated franchise?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, George always had an appreciation for the Yankees. Even growing up an Indians fan, he knew where the Yankees were. He realized what that meant. He realized that they were the most famous sports franchise in North America, if not the world. That logo was everybody in the world knows the Israelite NY. And look, when he was a younger businessman, making a lot of business trips to New York, he was always stuck in a middle seat in coach somewhere, and he always dreamed, said, one day I'm going to fly first class in LaGuardia Airport. And of course, later in his life, he flew thousands of times on his own private jet into LaGuardia and into the New York airports. And he always wanted to get a seat at the main table or the main room into the 21 Club, which is his favorite restaurant because it was a status symbol, certainly in the '70s. And whenever his secretary would call ahead, they'd always stick him upstairs, at the 4 o'clock reservation. And later on, of course, he got whatever table he wanted, whenever he wanted. If he wanted the whole restaurant, they'd give it to him. And he knew what being the owner of the Yankees would mean. He knew what being a player in New York would mean. And not only did he utilize that to his own benefit, but he used it as like the greatest asset when he was recruiting the players that made the Yankees the Yankees. When he signed Catfish Hunter and Reggie Jackson, he wasn't the highest bidder for either one of them. But he offered what Ray Kroc in San Diego, who sold 1 million Happy Meals, but couldn't offer the Empire State Building, to either of these guys. Ray Kroc really wanted Catfish Hunter, but Catfish wanted New York and not San Diego. Charles Bronfman really wanted Reggie Jackson, but Reggie was going to take some convincing to go play in Montreal. But he offered him $5 million. That was $2 million more than George was willing to go. But George told him all about New York and took him for a stroll through New York. And as if it was scripted, and George always swore it wasn't, cab drivers would honk at him, and, carriage drivers would yell, "Come on, George, you got to sign him. You got to sign him. Come on, Reggie, you got to go." And you couldn't make it up, but it actually happened. And that's the stuff that, George knew that Reggie's ego was going to drive him every bit as much as his wallet. And he turned out to be true. And it was a pretty profitable 5-year partnership.
You mentioned managers, maybe the one that had the biggest relationship and the storylines and the twists and turns was Billy Martin. How much do you dive into that in this book?
A lot. Look, I think Billy's the co-star probably of all the other co-stars in this world that I delved into. And look, I mean, he hired him and fired him 5 different times, and he was exactly the kind of manager George always wanted because he had a lot of football coach in him. And George himself in his younger days was an assistant football coach at 3 different Big Ten schools. And, so he always appreciated that part of it. They were actually very alike in a lot of ways, George and Billy, believe it or not. One was rich and had a very present father. Billy grew up dirt poor in Berkeley, California, never knew his father. Billy was a superior athlete, George a middling one. But they also had two things in common. And one was the fact that they both hated losing more than they loved winning. And that drove both of them crazy sometimes. And it certainly drove them crazy in each other's presence. And the fact is, they were both completely stubborn, mule like personalities. And of course, that was bound to clash. And every time they wound up working together, it did. And every time they would wind up missing each other. And George would inevitably bring Billy back. And, later on, it became something of a cartoon. And there's no question that Billy was primed and ready for at least number 6 on the day he died on Christmas Day, 1989, because George had already told him he didn't think he was going to go long with Bucky Dent that season, and so Billy was ready. He was
Wow.
healthy and ready to come back, and then unfortunately passed away. And look, I mean, Billy was, for a guy who looked older than he was, his spirit was a lot younger, so he would have gone on managing for as long as somebody would have hired him. And I have to think if there would have been a Billy 6, there would have probably been a Billy 7 and a Billy 8 too.
It would have kept going and going and going. People that maybe aren't sports fans know of, George Steinbrenner from Seinfeld. Is that something that you talk about in the book as well? The pop culture aspect of the Yankees and George Steinbrenner?
You know what, Mike? That was probably one of the most enjoyable parts of the book, was delving into the other stuff about George. There was a mini series once about the '77 Yankees called "The Bronx Is Burning," based on a really great book by Jonathan Mailer, excuse me. And um, Oliver Platt played George in the mini series and hammed it up. And Oliver Platt's a pretty established actor. And when I had talked to him when it came out, he talked about how he went into it kind of wanting to be a cartoon, and he was a Red Sox fan who grew up in Canada. But once he started to study the role and study who Steinbrenner was, he almost wanted to make it a tribute to, an homage almost. And it kind of comes across that way if you look at that series. But sure, the Seinfeld thing is hilarious because Larry David, before people knew him as Larry David, they knew him, or they knew his voice, because he played the voice of Steinbrenner in a couple of episodes. And he takes great delight in telling the story that at some point, when that became a very popular feature of the show, they actually invited George out to California to film an actual episode as himself. And he was so terrible doing it that they never ran it. And Larry David still chuckles when he talks about it and says, he was terrible. He was awful. I couldn't use it. And David's a pretty big time Yankees fan who, endured a lot of the bad George. So I think he didn't mind sticking it to him, even as they were all on the eve of doing something special, because that would have happened right at the beginning of the '96 season. And of course, George the Yankees got reestablished in that year and the years to follow in the latter stages of George's tenure.
Did you go into this book and the research with one idea of who George Steinbrenner was and come out with a different idea?
I think whatever ideas I had were probably strengthened. I don't think I found anything about his personality or his way of doing business that I found unusual to the Steinbrenner that I knew or had long heard about. I do think I was able to try and maybe humanize him a little bit. I think because he spent so much time on the back page, it was almost easy to forget that he was actually flesh and blood. And I tried to flesh that out a little bit anyway, and try and make him seem a little human. Of course, he was also a demanding boss, and sometimes he was a terrible person, and a terrible person to work for. I tell some of those stories in there also. But that's all part of what makes George so fascinating. I mean, somebody uninteresting would not be a compelling book. It'd barely be a compelling magazine feature. It was almost difficult to contain George's Yankees life to the 345 or so pages that are in the book, because there was so much about it and so many other stories I could have told. And look, the very first draft was probably 100 pages longer. And correctly, my editor at Harper, Sean Desmond, said, "You know what? We have to find ways to trim this, because there's a really good book in here that'll probably be about 350 pages." And he was right. It's the discipline of writing. Sometimes you have to do what you have to do to make stories fit. Sometimes it's writing 700 words in a newspaper column, and sometimes instead of writing 100,000 words in a book, you write 85,000 words. But I do think that the best of George is in there. That was how the book, we pitched the book to each other. Sean said to me, he said, "Approach it like you're writing 30 newspaper columns." And that really spoke to me in a real, voice I could understand, because for better or worse, I know how to write a newspaper column. And, approaching those chapters as 30 individual columns, longer than my usual column, but, the essence and the idea of having a little bit of my voice in there, a little of my experience in there. And look, every chapter as an interlude, many of which involve, what it was like to actually cover George, or the, the adjacent stories around George. I think those are actually the parts of the book people are probably going to wind up enjoying more because there are some funny stories in there, including the time in spring training when it was about a day-long battle for all the New York papers to figure out, how to use the word that George had used to describe Hideki Arabu when he called him a fat toad, and the word in the middle was like, the green ooze that comes out of frogs, right? And so there were actually newspapers that wouldn't use the word. I know the New York Post used, pussy rhymes with fussy, so they wouldn't get used to the other connotation of the word. So it was crazy day, and those are the kind of fun stories that you got. You don't get those from any other owner. You don't get even Jerry Jones, as out over the top and out front as he is. He's never actually assembled these kind of stories on his own the way George did, and that's why it was actually a privilege to put these stories together in book form. So people who might not know these stories will be able to know them and understand who George was beyond the image they have of him.
Any feedback from the family?
Hal was very cooperative with me. I told him, from day one what I was going to do, how I was going to do it. There was one time I talked to him extensively in a group, and one time, when just about everything else was done, I talked to him for about 2 hours, by myself, answered asked all the questions, all the hard questions, all the easy questions. And I know Hal, and the people at the Yankees know me. We don't always get along. I don't always write things they like, but they know I'm fair. So they knew that I wasn't going to be a hatchet guy who was like trying to, if there was a womanizing sword side to George, you won't know about it in the book because I didn't get into it because that wasn't what I was interested in. And I think that those are the kind of things that family members would probably be concerned about if you're going to delve into those kind of things, or family histories, or, family secrets. And that really didn't interest me as much as what the Steinbrenners meant to the Yankees and what the Yankees meant to the Steinbrenners. And that's really what I got into. And I think they trust me enough to realize that's all I was really about here on this project.
Again, the book Bosses of the Bronx. And again, we had you on in 2021. So it's been a while here. And I know back then you were dealing with some health issues, and those health issues continued as well. Give us an update on your health. And you had a big surgery since that point as well.
It's funny. You talked earlier when you gave the date of the first one. I can't believe it was 2021. But
Yeah.
when you said that, I'm like, oh, so this is the first time that I'm on this pod as a monoped. Because in August of 2022, so for variety, I'd had troubles with my ankles and legs for years. Former basketball player, and then someone wanted to have to battle some type 2 diabetes through the years, and I wound up with a bad infection in my left leg. And in August August that year they had to amputate below the knee, um, which in the moment, of course, was the most harrowing thing and terrifying thing you could endure. But look, even I was lucky enough that I had a very honest orthopedist, foot doctor rather, podiatrist who had told me, this is probably something that's going to happen to you at some point. And he didn't think it was going to be 2 weeks away, but just 2 years, 10 years. But it was 2 weeks later that I wound up in the hospital. And so I was at least in a good headspace to understand A, the necessity for this, and B, the fact that really my life would be better off than what I was experiencing, in the months and years before that. And it turned out to be absolutely true. I mean, my life now is better than it was even when I was talking to you in 2021, which was pre-surgery. Because even then I was scuffling around on canes and and braces and so forth. And I still use canes out of an abundance of caution, just because I don't want to lose the other leg anytime soon. But I've been able to do just about everything else. I'm able to resume my job. The people that I work for were kind enough to let me work through everything. And I guess if there's one person who actually wound up benefiting out of the terrible experience of COVID, it was me, because for 100 years, Mike, it was taboo to not write about games that you weren't at.
Yeah.
And people who did that were criticized, and I was probably part of the chorus of people who were rip guys who would not cover games in person. And of course, during COVID, there was no other choice, and we kind of got used to that idea. Now, look, I'm not saying that I prefer it, and in to almost every extreme, if I can be someplace, I'd rather do that than do it off TV and do it off televised press conferences. It's why I'm going to be on a plane to San Diego tomorrow. I mean, St. John's is playing out there, and when if I'm going to write about St. John's, I want to be courtside or in the building to write about it. That's the way you're supposed to do the job. I mean, now that said, I mean, I'll certainly spend some time when my health demands it, covering things remotely. But whenever possible, I try and get there still. I don't travel as often as I used to, but that's also because the kind of the nature of my job has changed, become a lot more hyper local, a lot more New York, New York, New York. And so obviously when those teams require travel, I do. And if I'm being honest, traveling is easier now than it's ever been because I just get wheeled through the airport on a wheelchair, and I'm first on the plane all the time, and there are things, there are a lot of things that are better about my life than they were before, just because I'm healthier and because I'm able to get around more than I was at the end. But I'm thankful my job was able to be there when I got back, and I wasn't way long, like I said, because my bosses allowed me to work through it.
And in 2023, you got back on the golf course as well, and you wrote an incredible article. You were the subject. What was that like? Number one, getting back out there. Number two, writing about yourself and making you again the focal point of this story.
I was schooled in a generation of people who were told, even when you write a column, avoid the first person. Don't say I think this guy should be fired. Just say this guy should be fired, right? So it's really kind of anathema to me to ever have the words I and me or us and we in a column. I do it sometimes, and look, sometimes when you write as many columns as I do, sometimes you have to go outside the envelope and write humorous columns, write columns about yourself, write columns about your adventures, your life and times. I don't do it a lot. Okay, I don't. But every time I do that, I do feel a little uncomfortable because I was raised to believe that wasn't the right way to do it. So to write 2,000 words about myself, it was hard to get into. I don't suffer from writer's block a lot, Mike. I didn't suffer from writer's block there. I just had a hard time getting into it because I knew that right away you had to start with an I in the first paragraph, and that's just not. I'm not comfortable that way. But look, I mean, I knew it was a story worth telling. I knew that not only was it a somewhat inspirational story, but I was hoping that people would read it, and if they had similar health issues, they might want to reach out. And I can't tell you how many dozens of people have. I mean, a lot of them actual amputees who are about to go through the procedure or recovering from it, or others, similar things that would keep you out of play for a while, and how you dealt with that. And so that made it all worthwhile. I mean, a large part of what I do now is trying to pay things forward. I got a lot of help in my career from a lot of people, and I like to pay that forward to the younger generations, students, younger journalists, anybody who wants to reach out to me. I really try and, I'm sure probably not perfect, but I try and reach out to anybody who reaches out to me, just because I know how much help I was given professionally. And it's like 10 times that when I'm talking about the healthcare professionals and the friends and the kind strangers who open doors for me, every day. Literally every day, somebody does something nice for me. And you know what? I think your viewpoint on the world changes that. I really do. People tell me that they think I'm, that I feel I'm the most optimistic person they know. I'm like, well, my wife might tell you a different story. I can be a little jaded in some moments, but I do believe that I honestly am around kindness every day. And it's not the kind that you seek. It's the kind that people just want to do because that's part of being a human being. And when you have that much of a good experience just in day-to-day life, I think it's going to affect everything you do personally. And I know for me, it's done so professionally. I don't take nearly as many cheap shots in my columns as I used to. I think I'm just as hard on people. I have no problem firing guys who need to be fired or trading guys who need to be traded. I have no problem getting after people who I cover. But I also don't do it needlessly, and I don't do it outside the boundaries of good taste like I think I might have when I was young.
Well, again, it was a great story. The great title, "Vac is back" as well. So that was awesome to see. I want to go back to your roots for a second with Saint Bonaventure. I know you're a proud alum there, and your buddy Adrian Wojnarowski leaves his job to become the general manager of the basketball program there. Were you surprised about that? Were you consulted about that at all?
I had a heads up that he was going to be leaving ESPN, a month or two beforehand, as friends talk. And of course, we all, I'm Italian, so I subscribe. So do you. You know about Omerta, right? The ancient Sicilian code of silence. So he knew that wasn't going anywhere. And so when the news broke, uh, it wasn't surprising to me. And a lot of people were like, "I can't believe you didn't say anything." I'm like, "Well, it's just what you do for friends, right?" He had mentioned the GM job. I just thought that he was going to throw his phone off the GW bridge, and him and his wife were going to go to Manhattan Beach, where they were already spending a good chunk of their free time, and just enjoy the beach, forever. But he was also a little too young for that. And look, he's a guy who burns to compete. And so, when he told me the day that he was retiring, oh, by the way, here's part two of that. It surprised me, but it didn't stun me, and I was actually delighted because, look, I mean, as fierce a competitor as he was as an NBA insider, I know he'd be exactly that way with this job. He would be fully invested. And now, look, I mean, the fact of the matter is that he kind of retired the trophy doing what he was doing. I mean, everybody acknowledged that he was the industry leader doing what he was doing. And, even his competitors, did. I mean, and so, he was really, he'd done what he could do there. Certainly he'd been well compensated for it. And I'm sure on one level it was hard for him, the son of a working class father to leave behind a pretty sizable contract, but he did it for his family and his health and his own well-being, and he was eager for new challenges. And I guess that could have been writing a book, that could have been writing a memoir, it could have been writing, any number of subjects. I mean, he obviously wrote the great book about the Hurley family years ago, but instead this opportunity presented itself at a time when the GM job was kind of in its nascent stage. And I'm not going to lie, it's been 2 years of ups and downs and a lot of stuff for him. But you know what? I think he's also built for that because in his job at ESPN, he was always getting slings and arrows, whether from agents, from other players who weren't on Team Woj. A lot of fans, I mean, if you're one to read Twitter or Facebook, when you have 3 million followers, the best advice is to leave it alone. And I think after a while he would learn to do that. But he knew that he would know when he was getting ripped, and so he develops a thick skin. So I knew that would serve him well in this job, and it has and it will. And look, I mean, I'm thrilled for him. It gives me an extra reason to root for the Bonnies every day. I mean, every game, and I have like my Bonaventure. This is a Bonaventure shirt, so I'm usually got something on to represent. But so yeah, so it's been exciting for me to watch him do this.
Have you had a chance to go out there see some games while he's now the GM?
A couple. I have. I didn't get to any this year just because I had the book coming and a lot of other things, and it was just difficult to make time. I couldn't even go to the Fordham game, which is usually something I do every year because it's a short trip for me.
Yeah.
But I didn't do that either. I went twice last year, and look, I mean, it's different. It's different. I mean, he's not the boss, but he's an influential part of this team that I followed for 40 years. So it's an interesting new phase for both of us, and certainly for him.
Again, New York Post since 2002. This book is coming out now. The Bosses of the Bronx. What else? What's next for you? How much longer do you do this? And it sounds like you certainly still enjoy what you're doing.
Well, Mike, if with your help, this book sells 2 billion copies,
That's right. That's
and I
right.
can, and I can buy Woj's house in Manhattan Beach, then maybe that's what's next for me. In the event that doesn't happen, look, I still love the job at the Post. I do. I mean, I really do. I wrote a column about the Fairleigh Dickinson women's coach yesterday, Stephanie Gately, and I was just as excited doing that column as I will be if the Knicks get to the NBA Finals. I mean, the job itself, day to day, still thrills me, and I still find different possibilities and different things to do that I've never done before in it. And so, as long as that's the case, and as long as the Post will have me, and look, I mean, the one great thing about the Post is that it seems to be that the people who run it are the last people on earth who truly and genuinely believe in the power of newspapers. So that's good for a guy like me who's never cashed a check doing anything other than newspapers. So that's, I'll certainly stick around as long as they'll have me. I'd like to think there's another book or two in my future. I wouldn't mind delving into fiction sometime in the future. I do think I've got a few ideas for what I'd like to do with my next project. And once I figure that out, I'll dive into that also. But, one of the great things about my day job, I think it helps me do the books. I've never taken a sabbatical to write, not even like 2 weeks off. I've always written through it. And I think it helps because the contrast between the way I write columns, which is all in like 650 and 700 word bursts, and the way you write the book, where you're writing 1,000 words, 1,500 words at a time. I love the contrast. I think one style feeds the other and nourishes the other, and they complement each other pretty well. And so, yeah, I'm still looking. Now, I might not have told you this if we'd had this conversation, around this time in 2022 when I could barely get out of the chair. But I feel that way now, and I'm thankful for it. And every day is a gift. And I look forward to. I still run to work. I remember one time my wife told me she was mad at me because things weren't great in her job, and she's like, "I just want to be like you. I want to get up every morning and run to my job. I don't know what that's like." And I appreciated her observation there. It's true, and it's still that way. It really is. I still enjoy every minute of it.
Yeah, that says something because not everybody is like that right
I
now.
know
And
how fortunate I am, and I joked earlier about how maybe I should have had higher ambitions when, as a 7-year-old, I told my father I wanted to be the sports columnist of the New York Post. But you know what? I think I have a lot more fun in my job than Governor Hochul does, or than anybody. Or than a lot of my friends who are lawyers, or have to deal with this with the fluctuating market on Wall Street, or any of those guys. I know I have a lot more fun in my job than they do. Maybe they were able to afford more fun
yeah,
lives away from things, but that's fine. I mean, I enjoy my job, and to me, my job, what's the wise man said one time? You get a job you love, you never work a day in your life, and I'm the living embodiment of that. I'm telling you that, my friend. That's for true. That's the truth, Mike.
there you go, there you go. I know you're on social media. Let our viewers and listeners know how they can follow you because you're putting some stuff out there as well about the book that's coming out.
Yeah, I mean, at Mike Vac, two C's on Twitter. It's at Mike Vac 67 on Instagram, and Facebook is just my name. So if you're on there, and especially if you say something nice about Boss of the Bronx, I'll definitely add you as a friend. And yeah, that's it. And I've actually begun the Instagram thing too, and I probably should know what my handle is there. I think it's the same as the Instagram one, so it's at Mike Vac 67. So yeah, then yeah, in the run up to this book, I'm doing things every day, every couple of days, just kind of little like 50-second video hits, just kind of teasing the book. That's been fun. It's got an interesting reception, pretty favorable. And who knows if anybody had the great mystery of how you sell a lot of books, somebody would sell that for a lot of money, and I'd buy it. But there a lot of things are about timing and luck, and hopefully good word of mouth. And, that's why I'm so appreciative to talk to you, Mike, because, if 5 people listen to this and say, "Oh, I'm interested in that book," that's 5 books that wouldn't have otherwise been sold. So I really do appreciate you giving me the time to talk about it.
And I'm sure it's a book that, yeah, obviously, if you're a Yankees fan, you're gonna appreciate it, but I'm sure if you're just a baseball fan, you can appreciate it just as much. Is that the case?
Look, I wasn't a Yankees fan growing up. In my house, my father's rule was you rooted for New York. You didn't root for a team. So we kind of like rooted for everybody, the Mets and the Yankees, the Jets and the Giants, and the Knicks and the Nets, on and on. Once I got to high school, I realized that wasn't an option, that you kind of had to pick sides. And so, I think I made the good choices. I picked the Mets, the Jets, and the Knicks. Good job. But I did pick the Islanders. So I had that going for me for a couple of years anyway when I was in high school. But so I was, but I wasn't a Yankees fan, but as a baseball fan, I always appreciated the Yankees. I always appreciated who George was. Even though I would declare myself a Mets fan, I didn't want the Yankees to lose, and so I would follow them. Maybe not as strongly as I did the Mets, but certainly strongly enough. And obviously, professionally, I've covered them both equally. But yeah, I don't think you have to be a Yankees fan to enjoy it. I think, look, I would say baseball fans, sure, but I think just if you're a fan of history and seeing how things work over the course of time, which is really what history buffs are interested in, right? Why is something different in 1763 as opposed as it is to now? Why was it different in 1973 when George Steinbrenner bought the Yankees as opposed to now when his son runs the team? And that's really what you're getting. It's a slice of about 50 plus years of history. And I think I give a lot of different elements that I think a lot of different people can appreciate and enjoy. So yeah, I would definitely think that look, as long as you don't detest baseball, you'll probably like the book. I mean, if you really hate baseball, you're probably just going to use the book for kindling, and I get that. But you know what? If you want to buy the book for kindling, that's fine. Just buy the book.
There you go. The bosses of the Bronx. I've got to let you know. So again, you are our very first guest. We try to get more guests. We've got a couple of guests because they thought I was you.
Hey, whatever
And,
works.
I clearly say no. I'm not that Mike Vaccaro, but he was our first guest. So
That's
I'm
really
very proud that you were our first guest. We've got Jim Cott, we've got Bob Ryan, other people I think that thought they were talking to you.
well.
So you're well known as a
Bob Ryan,
columnist, well
Bob Ryan is
respected
one
as well.
Bob Ryan is one of my heroes. He's one of my mentors. He's been just an unbelievable advocate for me for so many years. And so yeah, that's it's no surprise that the name probably perked up his ears. And I'm glad that you were able to utilize that. The thing is, back in the day, I used to the first podcast. I wore a goatee back then, so I'm a little more clean shaven. So they can probably tell us apart now better, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. Again, anybody watching or listening, we are not related, but we do share the
Maybe
same
back,
name and
maybe
somewhat
somewhere
the
back
same
to the old times, who
professions.
knows, right? You never know. Some back in Palermo or someplace, maybe there's a connection. But as
There you
far as
go.
you're not related.
Well, Mike, it's great to catch up with you. Glad to see your health is doing great, and excited to see this book, and hope it takes off well. Because again, it seems like you put a lot of time, a lot of effort into it, and certainly folks will enjoy it. The Bosses of the Bronx, get that book now and support Mike and what he does. Well, safe travels to you going to St. John's out in the West Coast as well to go root on and cover the Johnnies. It should be a lot of fun for those guys as well.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. It's great talking to you as always.
Well, again, he was the OG, the original guest that we had back in 2021. So great to catch back up with Mike Vaccaro, the New York Post sports writer. Sometimes get confused. People think I'm him, he's me, but that's not the case. But again, great to hear from him and hear about his new book. Go check out that book. It's coming out soon here, The Bosses of the Bronx. Whether you're a Yankees fan, a baseball fan, certainly it is a must read. And again, we thank him for joining us here today. We thank you as well for watching and listening. As always, invite you to like, to subscribe, and to share what we're doing. Great guests continue to come our way. We appreciate them as well. For JR Equipment, our creator, producer, and director behind the scenes, I'm Mike Vaccaro. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Another episode of In the Front Row. Have a great day, everybody.